Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third public webinar on the creation of a feasibility study to explore the potential of wind energy generation on the Great Lakes. I am Cheryl Huber with NYSERDA and will be leading us through our series of presentations related to this study. This is the third of 4 presentations that NYSERDA will be hosting this year. Today, we're pleased to be joined by the study research teams once again as they present their study topics in greater detail and describe early findings that will inform the science to support the Great Lakes Wind Feasibility Study. The study is being authored by 3 contracted teams, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, Advisian, and PTerra Consulting with the Brattle Group. Next slide, please. But before we begin, I would like to mention a few points of webinar logistics. Today's webinar is being recorded. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. You may submit a question for our question and answer period via the Q&A feature anytime through the presentation. The chat is disabled, but you will be able to communicate with panelists and presenters via the Q&A. This slide deck and recording will be posted to NYSERDA's Great Lakes Wind website, where you can find additional resources that include materials from the March and May webinars and the public feedback session that took place in June of this year. If any technical problems should arise during this webinar, please email Karen Fusco at the email address shown down at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. The agenda for today's webinar outlines the topics covered during today's presentation. As we do at the start of each webinar in this series, NYSERDA will first provide a brief overview of the feasibility study. Next, we will hear from each research team as they describe the topics being covered in the study. We will hear from NREL on lake resource characterization, port infrastructure, technology best suited to these conditions, cost analysis, and an overview of economic development opportunities related to potential Great Lakes wind projects. Advisian will then provide an overview of regulatory processes needed to permit energy projects in the lakes, a risk-benefit analysis that will consider various topics, including environmental conditions and sensitivities, and a visualization study to address potential viewshed impacts. We will hear from PTerra Consulting on joint work with the Brattle Group on how energy will get to shore in their grid interconnection analysis. And finally, NYSERDA will discuss public input received during the public feedback session and close out the presentation with a timeline for the remainder of the year leading to the publication of the feasibility study. We will conclude with a Q&A session where you will be able to ask questions to members of each of these research teams. Next slide, please. During today's presentation, we aim to revisit the order and conduct this feasibility study that has brought us here, to provide an update at this midpoint of the study. We plan to provide a high-level overview of the feedback we've received from stakeholders during our public session in June. And we also aim to provide an overview of the timeline for the remaining year and next steps for continued involvement. Next slide, please. New York State policy has a clean energy standard that is designed to fight climate change, reduce harmful air pollution, and ensure a diverse and reliable low-carbon energy supply. Under the state's nation-leading climate legislation, the Climate Act of 2019, the state's clean energy standard was expanded to require 70% of New York's electricity come from renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind, by the year 2030. Last fall, October 15, 2020, the Public Service Commission adopted an order to further expand the state's clean energy standard, including instructing NYSERDA to conduct a feasibility study of Great Lakes wind energy to assess the overall value and viability of this potential resource. The study is to consider the environmental, maritime, economic, and social issues, as well as market barriers and costs of developing wind in the Great Lakes. The Commission directed NYSERDA to commence this study within 180 days of the effective date of the order, and it's to be completed with a total budget of $1 million. The study began in February of 2021 this year and is scheduled for completion late 2021, early 2022. Next slide, please. The Great Lakes Wind Feasibility Study is just one part of a bigger process. The study is not a planning document. Rather, it is a non-directional information collecting exercise based in sound science that will inform the state if it should consider Great Lakes wind as a potential renewable energy resource or not. The study does not collect new data. Rather, the methodologies model and analyze existing data sources in new ways than compared to other studies. Once the study is delivered to NYSERDA, we will then submit the final package to the New York Public Service Commission. The Commission will then decide next steps, which can range from no further action to directing wind procurement of actual wind projects, or any variation in between, such as further study being needed or commissioning a small pilot project. Public input is an important part of each of these steps. NYSERDA has included these quarterly webinar updates and a discrete public feedback session through the study process. Additional actions by the Public Service Commission will include formal public comment per the regulatory process. Next slide, please. The scope of this study includes Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and the New York communities along these shorelines. This map is a regional snapshot that shows the depth contours of each lake, as well as neighboring countries, states, and other areas. NYSERDA is in discussions with state, federal, international, and tribal entities with interests in this geographic area. Next slide, please. I am pleased now to introduce Walter Musil of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, to describe his team and their components of the feasibility study. Over to you, Walt. I think you're on mute, Walt.
Can you hear me?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, good. My button said I was unmuted. Thank you, Cheryl, and thanks for the opportunity to lead this study. I'm the offshore wind lead at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and this is a team of 9, actually 10. We have an intern, Nina, that's not listed here. And we are leading this study for the feasibility of Great Lakes wind. My co-PI is Rebecca Green. Matt Hall and Steinhauser are leading the technical team that's looking at the technology that will be deployed in the lakes if this goes forward. Jeremy Stefik is leading the economic benefits and development and jobs portion of this. Mike Optis is our lead atmospheric scientist who conducted the resource study. Auburn Cooperman, Matt Shields, and Patrick Duffy are working on the site characterization and the economic modeling and cost modeling for this project. So we have a pretty deep team, and then this is we're integrating the work that's being done by the other teams as well. So, and Rebecca's really doing a lot of that. Next slide, please. So a big part of this is developing the physical site characteristics for the 2 lakes. And you see in the map on the lower left, the study domains of each of the lakes, which include all of the area on each lake that's controlled by New York. We have 2 lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And the Lake Erie side, you can see the area is about 1/5 of the size of Ontario, and we have the so the total areas are assessed there based on square miles. And then we did a very coarse delineation of those, excuse me, of those areas at 5 miles and at 10 miles. And you can see how the area is diminished if we look at just the portions of the lake that are out beyond those margins. And on the right side, you see the bar charts that show for Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And we've got 6 different parameters that we're checking. One is the bathymetry, or the water depth. Another is the ice cover, which all of these affect the cost modeling. So we have to collect this data in advance. The soil type, which is really the a measure of the soil stiffness, or how soft the soil is or how hard it is. The sediment thickness, which is a measure of how thick the layer is above the bedrock on the lakes, which is a very important factor in what type of technology is able to be used. The lake bed slope, which is the steepness of the slope, and some of the, when we kind of get concerned when it gets beyond 5% or 10%, so we need to know how much of that is rolling hills below that, below the lake surface. And then the mean wind speeds are really pretty steady on the lakes and very comparable to what we're seeing in the mid-Atlantic. So all of this is being collected, and these data will be used for various parts of the study and fed into our cost modeling. Next slide, please. So we have new wind resource data for the lakes. This is brand new. It's a new study that's being done by NREL. It's not part of this study, but we're using it. We're feeding it into this study. It updates the previous study, which was called the Wind Toolkit from 2015. And based on the results we're seeing, this new updated set, which is a 21-year record versus a 7-year record, so much better resolution on the long-term variability. We're seeing increases in the wind speed from roughly 0.2 meters per second up to maybe a whole meter per second in some parts, or even more. And the map on the lower right shows those differences. Anything that's kind of in the orange color means that wind speed increased over the last wind resource assessment that we did. So we're seeing nominal wind speeds of around 8.5 to 9 meters per second, which is really pretty good for an offshore wind resource. And those live links at the bottom, we may be able to see those, but we'll make sure that we have those available to you so anybody can access this data. Next slide. So another part of the data collection that we're looking at is the sediment thickness and how close to the bedrock it is. The bedrock will prevent you from putting in some of the standard technologies that are used in offshore wind in the Atlantic and in Europe. So we have to pay attention to that, and a lot of this will be site specific, but we're definitely in close. We have some bedrock that's close to the surface. Lake Erie on the west end is a little bit better than Ontario, and there may be some advantages to seeing some of that the sediment thicknesses be thicker in that area, but we'll have to take that as it comes, and a little bit more on that later. Next slide. One of probably the biggest determining factor in what kind of turbines could be feasible in the Great Lakes is the limitations and constraints on vessels and how big of a vessel can come through the locks of the St. Lawrence. And when we did a survey of the turbine installation vessels that are out there installing turbines right now in European wind farms and even in the US, the traditional installation vessels that are necessary to put those machines up are too big. They're too wide for the locks. And in a lot of cases, the drafts of the channel depths are too shallow, so we won't be able to get those big ships in. So as an alternative, we're looking at building ships that can service wind turbines on the lake, and this is an example. This picture that's shown is an example of a heavy lift barge that was assembled on an inland lake in the Netherlands, and this is the kind of thing that could happen in the Great Lakes as well, where you take several large barges that can fit through the locks or can be built on the lakes, and assemble them by fastening them together and then moving a large crane onto that platform. This is called the soccer pitch barge because it's equal to the area of a half of a soccer pitch. But it lives on the lake and it can install the turbines. But they won't be the turbines that we we've seen in the Atlantic they'll be smaller than that in order to accommodate the limited infrastructure. And we're looking at ports and the port requirements that are necessary for doing these installations. There's 4 on Lake Ontario, and there's 3 on Lake Erie. We're trying to down select and narrow that down to ones that are the most feasible. We'll talk about that probably later. But next slide, please. It all determines the turbines that can be installed on the lake. And this is an example of a turbine that we're thinking is a representative of the type of turbine that can be out there. Now, there's probably a dozen different turbine types that could be used that would be big enough to achieve the economics we need, but small enough that can meet the requirements and the limitations of the lake infrastructure. And so this is a GE Cypress 6 megawatt machine, which is a 164. The 164 means that's 164 meters of rotor diameter. And and there are other ones, but the main point is that the supply chains for land-based turbines are growing at a rate that has now achieved the 5 to 6 megawatt class, and it's going to be easier to tap into that supply chain than to keep the offshore supply chains alive that are now approaching 12 to 15 megawatts for that size turbine. Next slide, and I'll show you this this relationship now. So this is a comparison of some of the machines that are out there to some structures that you're familiar with and have seen the size of, the Eiffel Tower and the Empire State Building. But in the on the right, shown in the largest turbine is the new GE Haliade X, which is a 12 megawatt turbine. That turbine is going to be too big to put on the lakes. The GE Cypress is next to it. It's shown, it's comparable to the Block Island machines that were just installed. That's the first wind farm in the United States that was installed. But the Cypress machine is about 610 feet tall. And it's smaller, but it's probably a worst case scenario from the growing sizes of wind turbines in terms of looking at and analyzing visual impacts on the lake, which will be talked about by Vizian. That's the size turbine that we'll probably see being deployed. And FAA limitations, taking that into consideration, this is right at the limit that where those might be, although that's still something we're looking into. I just want to point out that the capacity of one of these machines, even this smaller, relative to the Haliade X, this one machine can produce enough power in a year to power 2,800 New York homes. Next slide. So now we're looking at substructure types, and it's very important distinction. Lake Erie is shallow and it freezes more. It'll have a different type of substructure than Lake Ontario. The fixed bottom substructures will be used in Lake Erie, which means the foundations are rigidly connected to the seabed or the lake bed. And you see some types that are being looked at. The key drivers for Lake Erie, and it will be true for Ontario as well, is to have a very low profile protruding through the water line. And that means a slender tower of some kind. That's important because when the ice flows come in late winter, we need to have a very slender tower through the surface so that the ice doesn't jam up, and it can be deflected through mitigation devices like ice cones. It's also important that we pay attention to the lake bed and the thickness of the sediments relative to the bedrock to make sure that the foundation types are suitable. And we may need to use shallow foundation types like gravity base or suction buckets, which are the preferred technology for LeadCo that's deploying project in Lake Erie already, and the port adaptability for those structures. And there's different scenarios for deploying them. So the next slide, please, is for floating substructures. Now, floating substructures have never been deployed in ice climates. As far as we know, they're very new, so they haven't been deployed in many places at all, in fact. But we're looking at these considerations in terms of how that might be adapted for deployments in the Great Lakes. And it's not all that different than what it would look like in the Atlantic, where they're thinking about projects in the Gulf of Maine, or out in the Pacific, where they're thinking about floating projects in California. We have to pay attention to the installation method and the compatibility with the soils. In this case, we're talking about anchors that are either driven in or dragged in by standard installation methods, and their ability to withstand ice flows. And so there may be some requirements to upgrade the anchor load carrying capability, but they have the same design drivers. There's going to have to be a low profile at the water line, which may restrict us to structures like the ones on the right. The spar, a tilt down spar might work, or a tension leg platform, or maybe some other hybrids that are being developed right now for this purpose. So we'll be looking at those. The ports for floating wind are substantially different than fixed bottom, because the floating substructures will be fully assembled in the port, and they'll be towed out, which means that the ports will have to be fully equipped to lift the turbines and lay down all the equipment that goes with them. But that does lower the cost, because the work out in the middle of the lake will cost more than work at quayside or in the harbor. Next slide, please. So now, after we collect all this data, we'll be able to run these cost models. So we have all the input parameters right, and we can do with our two models, we can do fixed bottom or floating scenarios, and look at the costs. And we're just getting started on some of this. Our model Orca looks at the technology or the geospatial parameters, and will generate the heat maps. And our orbit model will look at the very specific deployment scenarios and installation scenarios that make up the different project types. And they're down at the bottom, really small, but those are some of the examples of maps that we did for California, showing how the cost reduces over time as industry matures. Next slide, please. And finally, the jobs and economic development modeling is part of this. We'll get started on that after we and start looking at how those jobs affect the local economies as we engage the workforce in those regions. The port facilities will attract jobs and regional and support jobs, and it will also support the supply chain that evolves around this. So we'll have the induced impacts from those activities, as well as the direct jobs that come from building and installing wind farms. And we're looking at those workforce programs that are in some of the local vocational schools and community colleges. And that's my last slide. I'll turn it over to Vivian. You can turn. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay, next slide. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Andrew Krieger. I'm with Advisian. Our first slide here is just kind of an introduction to our team. We're led by Sarah Corbis, who's our overall lead on Advisian's portion of the study. John Brand is leading up the geosciences portion. Katie White, who you can hear from in a moment here, is leading up relative risk. And I'm going to talk to you about the regulatory and permitting roadmap. Next slide, please. Again, just kind of a quick overview of the portion of the study that Advisian is responsible for. As Cheryl laid out in the beginning, there's a couple of different entities working here. Advisian is doing 3 portions of the study. There's the state and federal permitting roadmap, which I'm going to talk about in a moment here. There's a geophysical and geohazard study that also has a viewshed component that you're going to hear about. And then there's a relative risk minimization, mitigation, and benefits study as well. Next slide. Okay, so wanted to talk about the permitting roadmap portion of the study first. The goal of the permitting roadmap was to investigate all of the major federal and state permits, authorizations, consultations that would be necessary if Great Lakes Wind were to be built. What would be the major authorizations necessary? The first thing I wanted to share with you all in terms of kind of preliminary findings was just a couple of comments about the unique aspects of Great Lakes Wind. Walt did a great job laying out why Great Lakes Wind energy would be unique from a technology standpoint and from like a physical standpoint from the lake, but it turns out it's also unique from a regulatory standpoint. Some of the folks in the audience here on the webinar are probably familiar with offshore wind energy in the Atlantic Ocean. And so that might be kind of your touchstone for understanding for what the regulatory environment. But the Great Lakes are a little different from that environment. So, for example, under the Submerged Lands Act, all of the waters of the Great Lakes that are between the New York coastline and the international boundary with Canada, all of those waters are the territorial waters of the state of New York. So that's different, for example, from the Atlantic Ocean, where you have first, state waters next to the coastline and then federal waters. Also, under the Submerged Lands Act, all of the lake bed that's underneath those New York territorial waters are also the property of the state of New York. So that's just one thing to keep in mind that's important there. Another thing that makes Great Lakes Wind so unique is that you're near an international boundary with Canada. And so there's several international agreements and places where the US cooperates with Canada on the national level and the provincial and state level. That's another unique piece. And another thing I want to mention is that as part of our study, we did some case studies about other similar wind projects in the US and also elsewhere. And one thing that's been brought up a couple of times during the feasibility study is the uniqueness of the Great Lakes for wind energy. And while at the moment there are no wind projects within the waters of the Great Lakes, there are other examples of freshwater wind farms in the world, in Europe, in Denmark, and in Sweden. So just starting off with a couple of ideas about what makes Great Lakes Wind unique from a permitting and regulatory standpoint. In terms of moving on with like preliminary findings, what we have found is that there are 14 major federal and state consultations, permits, and authorizations that would be necessary to build Great Lakes Wind. You can see on this table on the right, just gives kind of a really quick overview of what those are. I'm not going to read through every single one of them, but it's really just there for your reference. The permits and authorizations cover a really wide range of types of issues. You're looking at everything from protected species to marine vessel navigation to FAA and aviation considerations. And another really important one is that the New York State Office of General Services would need to issue some sort of grant or easement for the use of the submerged land if a Great Lakes wind farm were to be built. So a really wide range of issues are covered by these 14 major permits. The permits cover various stages of the development of a wind farm, everything from the surveying of the lake bed, in preparation for construction, to the actual construction of the wind farm and construction of cable installation, energy export cables. Another point I want to make is that we looked at different pathways towards permitting a Great Lakes wind farm. There is not just one pathway. There's several different ways that a wind farm in the Great Lakes could get permitted. For example, at the state level, the New York state level, the size of the wind farm in terms of how many turbines and the megawatt capacity could have an influence on the regulatory approvals required. For example, there's a new process called the 94C process that might only apply to larger wind farms. Another place where you can get sort of different scenarios or different pathways to permitting is under the Federal National Environmental Policy Act, where we call that NEPA. And under NEPA, there can be different lead federal agencies. And the lead federal agency could differ depending on whether the federal government, for example, were funding the project. So that's just another example of how there can be sort of different permitting pathways, if you will. Next slide, please. To help understand and communicate the permitting pathways here, we developed what's called a cross-functional process flow chart. And you see just kind of a quick thumbnail example to the right side of your screen here. We really just wanted to give you a sense of the format that we're developing. It's in process. And this is really just an example draft, again, just to give you kind of a flavor of what we're developing. Cross-functional process flow charts like this are great at showing activities of multiple entities. And so we are developing a cross-functional flow chart that shows the activities of the developer. It shows the activity of different federal and state regulators. And what you can see here in the kind of thumbnail example is that you have these horizontal rows, if you will. Each one of those rows shows the activities of one agency or the developer. And so this type of format really helps you see handoffs between agencies and actors, where there's integration points between the different federal agencies, where there are information flows, for example, from the developer to different authorizing entities. We're also showing opportunities for public comment and public announcements, kind of designating those with icons within the flow chart. And really the point here is that this is a visual guide that helps you see, the triggers that start permitting processes, where there are key decision points, where there are information flows. And hopefully what this accomplishes is allows the folks to see the various permitting processes, not as kind of these different siloed individual processes, but as one greater integrated process. So I'm going to hand things off to my colleague, Katie White, on the next slide. And she's going to talk about relative risk. Thank you.
Hi there, thank you, Andrew. We are currently in progress for our relative risks minimization, mitigation, and benefits study. To do this with the help of some contact with agencies, academics, and officials, such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife, New York Department of Environmental Conservation, USGS, and multiple different associations, as you can see in the table to the right. The table below is just an example of different construction stressors, such as increased vessel traffic, bottom disturbance, and post-construction stressors, such as noise and scour and EMF. It is very important to differentiate the difference between a stressor and a potential impact. For example, a stressor could be a long-term structure in the area. This could have different impacts on different species. One could be collision of certain species, another could be reef effect and other species being drawn to the new habitat and increased local biodiversity. Next slide, please. We are considering multiple different receptor groups that we believe may interact with or be vulnerable to Great Lakes wind, such as waterfowl, migrating birds, bats, certain habitat types like coastal wetlands that are key areas for different species, and stopover habitat. We are also looking at different physical obstructions and also just areas in the environment that could indicate more species use. The figure to the bottom is a little example that we've made of different known and potential wrecks shown as red and yellow stars in the eastern half of Lake Ontario, and also some protected areas, which are shown as green areas on the shore and inland, which could be key habitat for different species and stopover habitat for birds. We also indicate a submarine cable to the west of Lake Erie. These represent different physical obstructions and also key environmental areas that could help potentially assessing the different risk in different areas of the study area. Next slide, please. We are also currently underway with the visibility and related impacts. This is based on the composite data and parameters that are provided by NYSERDA and NREL. This will be a visual impact along the coastline and will be determined by using a baseline wind turbine substation design, GIS-based line of sight and over the horizon geometric analyses. And this will also establish zones of visibility for the nominal size height of the structures selected. Next slide, please. And thank you. That is a recap of what our Advisian team is doing. And now on to Rick from Brattle.
Thank you, Katie. My name is Rick Austria with Pitara Consulting. The interconnection feasibility task looks at the capability of connecting Great Lakes wind to the onshore grid of New York. And for this study team, comprised of myself and Hannes Pfeifenberger of Brattle Group, we looked at the existing grid and planned future grid to evaluate interconnection feasibility. Next slide, please. For Lake Ontario, we looked at what we call points of interconnection, or POI, which are basically existing substations on the grid rated at 115 to 345 kV. These actual transmission line routes are shown in red on this map. And then the pins are the substations where we evaluated the capacity for receiving power from Great Lakes wind and connecting it to the existing land-based grid. Next slide, please. The points of interconnection for Lake Erie are shown here. There are relatively fewer locations to connect except near the Niagara area. Each POI is characterized by the size of the Great Lakes wind capacity that can be supported. The analysis is based on the solo capacity headroom methodology. That's a straw proposal from DPS for such calculations. For the initial selection process, we identified POIs based on linear straight line distance of 30 miles from the lakeshore. These will be further filtered by the other team members to determine the other features that will limit the capability to interconnect to these POIs. Next slide, please. For the analysis, we identified the headroom capacity for each of the POIs, and then we looked at grouping these POIs into regions. The capacity to interconnect at the existing grid is limited by the ability of the grid to transfer that power to the loads or the customers. And regionally, there's a certain limit that can be allowed, and this is determined by the headroom calculation method. So we divided Ontario interconnection points into 4 regions and Erie into 2 regions. The numbers that are shown here on the slide are preliminary values for the amount of megawatts that can be interconnected on a headroom capacity basis. These numbers may change in the final version of the report. Next slide, please. So in terms of the progress on the interconnection feasibility, we looked at power flow models, which are models of the electric grid developed by the New York ISO, as well as new models that Pitera and Brattle developed to represent 2030 operations with 70% renewable energy supply. From the initial set of points of interconnection, we calculated headroom capacity, and then we grouped the POIs by geographic region to identify the capacity on a regional basis. And the pending task for this study is to identify headroom capacity for the combination of all the Great Lakes wind that may be interconnected from Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. That's the update from the interconnection feasibility team. Next slide, please. And thank you for listening. I turn this over to Cheryl. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you to all of our presenters today for that information. Next slide, please. Oh, this is the correct slide. Thank you. In addition to the quarterly webinars, email correspondence, and website resources, NYSERDA added a dedicated public feedback session that took place on June 9th, 2021. 110 people were in attendance, and 25 people offered verbal comments. Written comments were also accepted for an additional week following the event, which resulted in 62 additional comments to NYSERDA. The comments were binned into 5 topics of interest: the role of wind energy in transition, policy and planning, potential future siting considerations, environmental impacts, and socioeconomic impacts. The report is in its final stages of completion and will be shared with the study authors to address in the narrative of the study itself these topics and the comments that we received. It will also, this summary report will also be appended to the final study for submission to the Public Service Commission. Next slide, please. Thank you. The summary report outlined these comments in its final stages of preparation. I'm sorry, the summary report outlining the comments that were received is in its final stages of preparation, as I mentioned, and will be available on NYSERDA's Great Lakes Wind website in the coming weeks. We are hoping by the end of August for the public to view. The report offers practical considerations for each of the topic types that consider all collective comments, those both for and opposed. There are some examples listed here and found in the report. I'm not going to read through all of these, but of note, a few from each category include understanding how potential wind projects in the Great Lakes could mitigate the impacts of climate change, consider the views of public and provide transparent information on the studies and inputs from other sources, discuss the use of public resources for energy generation and articulate the differences and similarities between energy generation in the lake and the rest of the state. Next slide, please. So again, to continue those 5 categories, the other 2 remaining here, some highlights and examples. I'm not going to read all of this, but some highlights include addressing the potential for lake contamination and concerns for public health related to the Great Lakes as a water source and environmental habitat, understanding economic opportunities and impacts on existing industries, as well as potential industries, including those related to disadvantaged communities. This will all be available on these slides on the website, as well as in the final report itself in the coming weeks, as I've mentioned. Next slide, please. The remaining timeline for the completion of this study is mapped out here. We expect to have a draft version of the study for this fall and a final study with publication in early 2022. Based on the findings of the study, the Public Service Commission will likely conclude if Great Lakes Wind is a feasible addition to the state's renewable energy portfolio in 2022. Next slide, please. There are multiple ways stakeholders can still be involved in the creation of the study. Please participate in this year's remaining webinars, the 4th in this series to be held in October of this year. There may be additional webinars related to the study once the final is published. And continue please to utilize the email and website to communicate with NYSERDA. Next slide, please. And with that, we have reached the conclusion of today's presentation. We will take the remaining time to answer your questions that we have received. So we go over to that. Right. First question received this morning is, will a summary from the public feedback session be available soon, preferably before the next webinar? As I just mentioned, the report itself will be available on the website by the end of this month, and a summary of the stakeholder outreach efforts that NYSERDA has done will be included in the study itself. Then the report will be appended to the final study and included with the submission to the Public Service Commission. Let's see, next question. Of the questions made for content to the feasibility study, have any been incorporated into the study, or will they be incorporated into the study? If so, which ones? Yes, that was outlined in some detail, but I covered it rather briefly during the last few slides of this morning's webinar. The report in its entirety will be provided to the study authors, as I've mentioned, to ensure that these comments are addressed in the study. And it will either be directly addressed as by the work that is currently being done, or there'll be a note that will indicate that more work is needed to be done to answer that question because it wasn't in the scope of the study as written. I'm going to answer another question here related to outreach. How many lakeshore town supervisors have you made aware of this study and this webinar? How many are participating today? I don't have a list in front of me right now of who is participating, but I can say that NYSERDA's clean energy teams are in steady contact with municipal governments and local officials throughout the state and are always available and glad to engage with local officials. If you are a local official who would like to learn more, please reach out to the Great Lakes Wind mailbox following this webinar, and we will be pleased to support a direct briefing. Also, to answer that question, registration for this webinar and events related to the study are widely shared via the website, email listserv, and social media. Also, in addition, it's important, I think, here to mention that NYSERDA is enhancing its outreach efforts to include print media campaign, and this is something that is a direct reaction to the public and comments that we have received. That there should be that kind of print media, as well as not just a reliance on electronic means of outreach with the communities. One more here, and then I'm going to turn it over to some of our scientific research presenters. Can we get the CVs of all of these NREL team members and Advisian and personal association with the Great Lakes? I'll say here the introductory slides at the start of each section introduce the researchers and their titles. Profiles of researchers can be found on their respective organizational websites for NREL, Advisian, Brattle, and PTERA. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to some questions. I think that this one is related to environmental research. So I'm going to send this over to Sarah Corbis at Advisian. Sarah, I'm going to read the question and then you can provide your response. If you wanted to put on your video, you can, but not necessary. I just want to make sure you're unmuted. How can you properly evaluate risks to the environment and ecology of the lake without any plan as to how the wind turbines will be placed in the water? How much will the lake bed be disturbed? Sarah, is that something you mind answering for us?
Sure. So at this level, we're talking about a feasibility study. So specific projects will have to be evaluated in the permitting and stakeholder processes if future Great Lakes Wind is adopted by the Public Service Commission. At this stage, we're seeking to understand and improve the state's understanding of general and relative risks and opportunities across the study area. And a detailed study of any specific wind farm, should one be proposed, would be scrutinized and local impacts, including lake bed effects and the variety of other stressors and potential impacts that we've discussed.
That's great. Thank you. And since I have you, I have another question here that was related to the visibility study, and I know that Advisian is conducting that study. I'm not quite sure what the entire question is, but it says 600-foot tall turbine visibility from shore question mark. So Mike, I'm assuming that this person here is asking how that height will be incorporated into the visibility study. Do you mind taking that one as well?
Sure, yeah, no problem. So we're using the nominal turbine heights that are provided by NREL. So NREL had a slide that described the anticipated types of turbines, and it's a demonstrative turbine. So again, in the case of having an actual project proposed, one would use the actual parameters of that project's turbines and the placement of the turbines and the distances apart and all of that, and do a more specific study to a project. In this case, we're looking more at this generalized turbine and assessing potential for visibility from shore.
Thank you. I'm going to switch over now to a question about local labor. What percentage of local labor is being used in any of the current land-based wind projects in Western New York? This particular question, this particular presentation is designed around this feasibility itself. So I'm not sure that we have the exact answer, which we can get to, but I will say that consistent with New York's public service law and the prescriptions of the Public Service Commission orders, NYSERDA's clean energy procurements incentivize in-state expenditures, including job creation, supply, and infrastructure improvements, and are underpinned by requirements to pay prevailing wage and project labor agreements throughout renewable energy project construction and project peace agreements through operations. And so because that is our state standard, any type of labor agreement, or if we even get that far, will be covered per the state policies. If that answer did not directly address that question, we'll be happy to follow up after this webinar to provide you with that information. Okay. Next question. Let's see. What size turbines, NREL? And the answer, I think, was this was answered right after that the question was submitted. And right now, I think the demonstrative turbine size that we're looking at is that 6-megawatt machine. Let's see here. All right, this is another environmental question. So I'm going to turn this to Advisian. Sarah, if you don't mind answering again. Who is addressing electromagnetic interference, EMI, electric shock drowning, ESD, transmission heat loss, and decommissioning?
Sure. Yep. Yes. So those are aspects of our portion of the study, and we're integrating different potential stressors, as Katie mentioned. And the slide that we provided isn't a full suite of all the stressors that we're looking at. So that's an example of some of the things that we're assessing. And that would be throughout the life cycle of a wind project: pre-construction, construction, post-construction, decommissioning. A lot of the decommissioning related impacts would be relatively similar, or stressors, I guess I should say, would be relatively similar to construction impacts. So in terms of electromagnetics, we are looking at that, and that's often something that comes up relative to cables. So we are addressing that in our study.
Thank you. I do have one other question related to birds and bats. Sarah, if you wanted to take it, since I have you, that would be great. I was curious to hear about how you're going about researching risks to bird and bat migration in the area. Do you have any findings so far? If not, what methods are you using to determine potential risk?
Yes, so yeah, thank you for that question. Birds and bats are, of course, a strong focus of the study, given the potential vulnerabilities to Great Lakes wind. Essentially, the way that we're looking at any of the species or habitats or user groups is looking at it through the lens of the stressors that we've identified that could potentially impact those groups, and then considering those groups in the context of their vulnerabilities. So, for example, birds that nest near shore may have vulnerability to cables coming to shore, or port development, or some kind of terrestrial infrastructure development. Birds that forage offshore might have attraction to turbines and have the potential to collide with them or be displaced by them. Migratory birds also go through areas potentially where turbines would be. So looking at each of sort of the types of activities of the animals and the groupings of animals in the case of birds to understand what the vulnerabilities may be. And then there may be other things that make animals more vulnerable, such as being an endangered species. So we're looking at that through the context of the vulnerability and then the potential severity of impact. A temporary disturbance, like a temporary behavioral disturbance, might not be as impactful, let's say, as collisions that could cause injury or death. So so we're taking that in the context of the existing data, as pointed out earlier, and we're meeting with a variety of different researchers, including the agencies and some of the other folks who do research on birds and bats in that case, to understand the ongoing research, the available data, the information that they've learned and published, or what's maybe unpublished, so we can get the best available information for the study. I guess in terms of the part of the question about what have we found, we're still in the process of analyzing the data. So we will hopefully, you know, as we go through future webinars, there'll be an opportunity to report some of that information as we get the outcomes of our study.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question here. What about the impact on radar array installed by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security? I know this is a question we received during one of the last webinars as well. And I'll say that radar considerations are actively considered by federal agencies under the Wind Turbine Radar Interference Mitigation Working Group, which has a website at energy.gov. I'm sorry, windexchange.energy.gov. Border control constraints, radar and aviation is also the subject of the Federal Aviation Authority and Department of Homeland Security's jurisdiction, and review of that would be a necessary part of any prospective project's permitting approach. So hopefully that answered that question. I have a question sort of comment here. Marine sanctuary for Lake Ontario is underway by NOAA and could be extended to Lake Erie. Did you know? Yes, actually, NYSERDA, as well as folks who are committing the conducting the permitting piece on the Advisian team, are speaking in close coordination with our federal partners at NOAA, as well as our state partners at the New York State Department of State. I believe the Advisian slide did have pinpoints to demarcate some of those known wrecks that are part of the proposed marine sanctuary there in Western Lake Ontario. Let's see. Next question. 1 second here. Lost my thing. Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Community benefit agreements should ensure ratepayers and taxpayers are better off as a result of the project. More jobs, stimulate the New York economy, save ratepayers money, protect the environment. I'm not sure there was a question there. It was more of a comment. But as I previously mentioned, consistent with the New York Public Service laws and the prescriptions of the Commission's orders, our clean energy procurements will make sure that job creation, supply and infrastructure improvements are underpinned by requirements to pay prevailing wage, as well as project labor agreements during our renewable energy project construction and project peace agreements through the operations components of those projects. I think we do have time for one more here, trying to get them all in. Will there ever be, in-person public comment sessions? I'll say that the intention of these webinars is to inform the public throughout the entire year in the process of the creation of this study on the process, on the findings, and on all of the information that we're getting to be as transparent as possible. COVID restrictions are such that right now that there are not any public comment meetings proposed, but that can be addressed on a one-on-one basis. If anybody would like to request one, we can have that discussion. Please email us at the Great Lakes Wind at nycerta.ny.gov email address. And of course, if there were any further need for public comment in a formal regulatory sense, that would be addressed separately from the study itself and these webinar efforts. Okay, I think we're at our last slide. So with that, we've reached the conclusion of today's presentation. Thank you so much to the teams at NREL, Advisian, Pitera, and Brattle for participating today. As I mentioned before, if you have additional comments or questions, please contact us at Great Lakes Wind at nycerta.ny.gov and visit the study website to access additional resources and the public webinar library. That's it. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning and have a great rest of your day.